Hi, I'm Dr. Andy Hemmings with the Aucilla Research Institute, and I'd like to talk briefly and give about Pleistocene or Ice Age tools made from all of the animals that were available at the end of the Ice Age that we know people here in North Florida encountered. There's probably some more, but the ones we do know about tell a pretty interesting story on a whole bunch of different topics. The animals we know that they used are mostly extinct, and we recognize that about 13,000 years ago, the mammoth, the mastodon, the paleo llama, direwolf, went extinct, and there's also deer is a fairly common tool that we think is probably the same age as well. Right? The deer is a very common animal that is used to make tools that we think is available at the same time. The vast majority of the tools that we find are in fact stone, and so the preservation of the organic material, we sometimes find wooden artifacts like what we believe is about a 10,000-year-old tent peg pounded vertically into the dirt at Page Ladson in the upper or in the middle in the lower Aucilla. Other things, sometimes hints of things made from plant materials. On some deer bone tools, and this is just a modern example and it doesn't have what I'm going to show you, but sometimes the surface kind of fossilizes and preserves anything that was stuck to it, and we do occasionally see imprints of cordage or twine, and this is just some probably hemp cordage. In the example I'm showing you here, it was wrapped around a bone tool that we rolled in dental plaster. This is just to make an imprint, and what it did is we made imprints of two different kinds, made very differently, but two different kinds of cordage. So it's a little bit of indirect evidence. We don't know what species they were using, but it clearly shows some of these bone tools were hafted using handmade cordage as well. Like I said, in that case, it was a deer bone tool. In Florida, we have a bit of a conundrum, and it's a good one, but it's a problem in that we get preserved kinds of tools that don't exist anywhere else, and there's not a lot of them. This is a rib from a mastodon. There should be a round ball on the end of it. You can see here that it's been cut and chopped. The ball that goes in between the vertebrae is missing. I'm trying to stick it into my backbone. And it made a very nice sharp point that probably was used in some form as a digging tool. It could have been hafted to a split stick and been used as a much bigger digging tool. The truth is, this is the only one, and we don't know for sure what they were doing with it, but we do know what animal it came from, and that animal's been gone, not available to make tools out of for at least 13,000 years. Another kind of thing, I believe there's two of these known. This is called a spinous process. And all that means it's the big spike. If you feel the middle of your back and you can feel just the top of your vertebrae, that would be out here on the end of this. This is a thoracic vertebrae, so up in the top of your back. That should be about as thick as my fingers. That much bone is missing. It's been ground off. And we don't know for sure. It looks like they were doing something like this. You put a little sand in there, and on the inside, this is the outside of a deer hide, on the inside of a hide, if you're trying to take the flesh off, it's a nice grit way to peel it off and clean it up. Like I say, again, two of these known. We think that's what they were doing, but we don't know for sure. We can identify the species and say this is a mastodon, it's a spine from the back where its big hump is, and that it's missing a bunch of bone, but we don't know for sure. And part of the reason is we need it in a better context. If we found it laying on a hide that was piled with sand around it, maybe we get that right. This is one of my favorites. This is the only one in Florida, and these are casts of the real ones. this is a patella or a kneecap of a mastodon, and it should be almost twice this size. We think perhaps somebody was using it as an anvil while they're flint knapping. They put it on their knee and use it as a brace. This isn't a stone tool, but while you're knapping, instead of jabbing it into your leg, you let the bone take the abuse, and there's little cut marks and scrapes and chops all over it that don't have any other clear purpose. And I'm guessing when I say that, but again, that's the beauty of finding things underwater, preserved in an anaerobic environment. And an anaerobic environment means there's no oxygen. And what's really interesting, when you excavate those layers of old strata, the layers, sometimes it'll be leaves, then you'll get into a little stringer of sand, then there can be gray clays or silts, and then other, gravels and sands, and it alternates. Those layers weigh a lot and they compress each other. They're actually dry when you're excavating until you expose them. And it's always fun in the field to pull out a wad of leaves. They're not really a peat yet. We do find peats, but sometimes there's a thing called sapropel. And all that is undigested organic material that's been compressed. So you can get a chunk of it and you break it. It's like trying to tear a French loaf or tear a hamburger bun in half. And when you do, and if you've brought it to the surface, when you do that, the inside is dry. Well, anaerobic, no oxygen, and really in these cases, it's dry, no light, no organisms, no bacteria and anything attacking it. It's hidden in the back of the fridge forever. And we get incredible preservation because of that. Another example, I know of parts of 4 of these now. It's the long, straight bone. It's a metatarsal in the back leg of a Pleistocene horse. We call them bone daggers, for lack of a better term, just to describe them. 2 from the Aucilla have a hole drilled right in the center of the end like that. They're very thin and made to a point. It looks like a dagger, but what they're really doing, it could be a shuttle, for weaving, no idea. But the fun part then is I get to make up explanations for these things. Here we have another, there's 4 halves like these now known from a juvenile direwolf, probably weighed in the neighborhood of 125 to 150 pounds. The front teeth have all been cut off. This is a bear jaw, same size, and you can see the bear is much bigger, but what's missing are the canines and incisors. They've been cut off on both sides of the jaw. This is the right that I have facing you now, and it's been drilled, so there's actually a hole. It probably doesn't show up on my black shirt, but you can see, hopefully some light through there, that there's a hole drilled through it. And what it looks like, they ground down the sides, the bottom, and drilled through both sides, and it looks like somebody made a mask about like this. Again, my best guess, based on similarities with things several thousand years newer in Ohio, where they're doing a similar thing. Again, we have to use analogy and just our best guess at figuring these kinds of things out. Some things are a little easier to understand, and mercifully, that's where the story sort of started with complete ivory points like this. And there's something really interesting going on that took us a while to figure out. You notice how the haft, this little beveled section back here, it's all cut up and scored so you can tie it down to a long stick, like basically make a thrusting spear. It almost looks like the tine on the end of a pitchfork. And I think that's probably what's going on. And the reason I say that is we're trying to explain the existence of, at this time, 13,000 years ago, stone Clovis points, long, curved ivory points, and then shorter, straight bone and ivory points. And this is another one from Florida, made of ivory. Basically, it boils down to if they're 25 centimeters or shorter, bone or ivory, across North America, if they're 25 centimeters or shorter, they're straight. If they're 251 millimeters, 25.1 centimeters or longer, they're curved, and that beveled haft is on the outside of the curve, meaning that when you haft it, it's going to set up about like that. Why are they doing all 3 things? Short or shorter, straight bone and ivory points, stone points, and long curved ivory points, and they're all ivory when they get much longer for some reason.
When you figure that out, please let me know, because it's one of those things that we continue to argue about, that we just don't know. There's they've never been found in a context that would let us figure that out. What's particularly compelling about this one, and this is a beautiful, complete one, it's actually been glued. The two pieces were found 5 years apart by a father and son team. And what's really interesting, and it won't show up, we'll try and do a close-up, there is a zigzag design where somebody took a really fine piece of stone and went up and down 28 times without lifting off the edge of it. And they did it again over here. It doesn't show up quite as well, but it's 28 times up and down again. That number 28 is kind of interesting. Down not far from Miami, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong coast there. The people from the University of Miami working at Warm Mineral Springs on the West Coast found a piece of antler that had 28 little ticks carved in it. Has anyone figured out why the number 28? How many days between a full moon? I'm not saying that's what it is, but it might be that, and whoever did this did it on purpose. There's no reason to do 28 twice, and the only other piece that has multiple ticks and design elements like that, probably a few thousand years younger than this. This one's probably about 13,000 years old. The one down there in the 8 to 10,000 year old range, I would guess. I'm not positive on that, but clearly the people that are making these things and living with these animals in the end of the Pleistocene are paying very close attention to the animal's behavior and anatomy. And this is a really fun aspect of all this. So tusks grow out of the skulls of mammoths and mastodons almost as though they were a stack of cups. Imagine you were taking a bunch of plastic cups or solo cups and you just keep adding one, and as you add one at the end, the open end is in the skull. It has the nerve. When your teeth hurt and you feel a root, well, imagine the root or a root canal for an elephant with an 8-foot tusk that's about that big around, and it keeps pushing out. And eventually you get out to where all the cups are compacted about 4 feet out in front of the animal. So it's very dense ivory. It's nothing but solid ivory like this. This is actually a piece of ivory made into a tool from right at that point where it goes from being the open pulp cavity to the compressed, nothing but dense ivory from there out to the tip. And it's orientable. You can tell how each of those cups or layers of growth are related and oriented. Every single one of these ivory tools that we've ever looked at, and you can cut or we've done it with fragments of them and cut them and looked under a very powerful microscope. The people making these were paying attention. Without exception thus far, the haft end is from the inside of the head, or from the proximal or skull side, and the point is from out at the tip of the tusk. It's oriented. They're keeping track of where the piece of ivory they're working down to these points is coming from in the skull in order to keep that business end solid. If you hit it the other way, if you oriented them the other way, they would have a tendency to splay, and they don't really do that. They don't compress and come apart. They are pretty solid, and that's in part why when they've been cut down to these and shaped and polished, and you burnish them, which is just the fancy word for saying probably took a rock and just smoothed the surface out, that so much so that 13,000 years later you can see even in a cast that this thing is shiny because it's polished. But it means they last for a long, long time, and they are very durable, resilient tools. There's been one example anywhere in North America, and it came out of a site in the Aucilla River, a barbed piece. Among archaeologists and people who are interested in artifacts, there's sort of a bit of a debate about if these are actually points, which they are, or if they're foreshafts. And what that would mean is that they are putting a stone point on the end here and lashing that down, and using that then in a wooden shaft. So you have a long wooden shaft that this goes into a socket with a stone point on the end of it. Well, you probably see some problems based on things I said earlier. If they're 25 centimeters or longer, they're curved intentionally with a haft on the outside, suggesting that you have a foreshaft that you're going to launch for shooting around corners, and doesn't make much sense. And certainly this barbed piece is obviously not a foreshaft. There's a mending chunk of it that is broken in the middle of this haft that suggests this one was almost exactly 25 centimeters long, and it was straight. So they're points. We can probably, I think, safely assume that based on observation and replication of tools. This is a smaller kind of ivory tool, probably not actually a point. We consider it an awl. And the reason I say awl, and what I mean by that is it was made to punch holes, probably in leather. The tip is incredibly polished. It's not chipped or broken. It's been resharpened after some use, but that little tiny tip was used to bore a hole through things. And what's really interesting is over the last few years, 2 smaller tips of ivory needles have turned up in materials collected at Sloth Hole in the lower Aucilla River. These are bone examples that I made out of deer. I didn't have any mastodon ivory handy, but they are roughly the size of and shape of the points. They're actually a little bit bigger than the I'm sorry, not the points. This is the size and shape, perhaps a hair too big for the ivory needles there, but you can see that it gets smaller very quickly compared to the awl. The real ivory needles are actually a little bit smaller than that in diameter. Really finely made. And there's a couple of tricks. You see the nice hole drilled in that, and you can see readily that this is a needle. And this is in fact a replica of a bone needle from Sloth Hole, but I just don't know how old the real one is. I cheated on this one. This I did with a tiny stone tool. You can see that little hole. Probably that shows up on my shirt, all right. I cheated. It was for a TV show. I needed it right away. This is an unfinished needle that I drilled the hole first. And that's the trick with doing these, to get the hole centered and where you want it. You drill the hole first. These are little holes drilled in some bone beads. Or they're preforms. This is a needle preform, there's a bead preform. And if you drill the hole first, then you shape the bead or the needle around it. And these are tricks we know that people were doing because we found some broken ivory beads at Sloth Hole, of all things. Other strange ivory things. This is a fragment of some little circular pot. Antler pieces similar to this that are called paint pots, for lack of a better term, made from deer antler, are found all over the southeast. But this is, as far as I know, the only fragment of one made from ivory. So this sets us up for a problem, though. People are here for 1, 2, 3, maybe 5,000 years, back to as much as, close to 15, if not 20,000 years ago. And I'm sure that we'll continue to move the goalposts farther and farther into the past as we get more and better information. But the door to the Ice Age closes pretty strongly at 11,800 years ago. That all these animals that people have been coexisting with for several thousands of years cease to exist. Well, that means you're not going to use their hides to make clothing. Whatever you're sewing is not from an animal that's not there anymore. Whatever meat you're eating has to be from those animals that survive. A smaller form of bison, deer, bears, maybe a handful of other much smaller animals like, raccoons, possum, rabbits, hares, the things that we have around today. But it also means you're not making 1.5 foot long ivory points anymore. You're not making mastodon patella or mastodon kneecap anvils or other tools from the ribs and spines or from the jaws of dire wolves or the legs of deer or paleolama. There's another one of these known from paleolama. In terms of the anthropological thought about what happens here, is it means not only does the source material change and obviously change what you can actually make, what your tools are going to look like anymore. There's going to be a big hiccup. You're going to change to something else. But it also probably affects your behavior. Why did this happen? What do we eat now? When you could get an 11,000-pound mastodon and everybody could come and you had the big festival and everyone ate great for 6 weeks, we can't do that anymore. And in part, you start seeing people settle down a lot more. population starts to grow up in a general trend. It's over a long term, it goes up an awful lot. But the ability of humans to adapt to changing environments and changing available resources is incredible, and is, of course, how people don't merely survive at the end of the Ice Age when things change so much, not just the landscape, but the available food resources as well. But it's really why people are able to thrive, and that opens up a whole bunch of other topics we can discuss.